So I'm going to put this back on speaker view. And yeah, I've got hands raised. Let me go to Jared first then. Jared, go for it, sir. Oh, and you know what? Sorry, that's my fault. Allow participants to unmute themselves. That would help.
There you go. Excellent talk. That was really interesting. Thank you. I was curious, so are you suggesting more of a materialism, physicalism perspective? Or are you looking at more of a metaphysical panpsychism perspective? Like, is consciousness pervading everything and is like, that's how the information is getting transferred back in time? Or is it from a physicalism like tachyons or some, superluminal particles, or right? How is the information in your perspective traveling backwards through time?
I think, what do I think? You noticed that I was agnostic about that at the talk. So thanks for bringing it up. Now it pushes me. I think that photons are not, I think they're not billiard balls by any means. And I think that, I don't know if they're conscious or not. I don't know what consciousness is. I wrote a whole book about consciousness. In fact, it's a textbook about consciousness. I still don't know what consciousness is. And so it's hard to answer any questions about consciousness. But I think that the nature of the universe includes, so normally when we think about the nature of the universe, we analyze things like in cognitive neuroscience. This is going to be a long answer, but it's going to make sense. I think in cognitive neuroscience, a lot of it started with visual neuroscientists trying to describe what happens in the brain when you see like a photo, which is frozen in time. And they got really good at that. And then they had to start to extend it to movement, which was harder, but doable, right? Still easier to deal with the whole photo thing because it's still, right? I think the same thing happens in physics, is like we get to general relativity and it's like, okay, so it's space-time, but we're going to think about it all as space. And also, we're going to kind of ignore the fact that there are even implications in general relativity where if you change like the duration that a planet exists, that will instantaneously, change, like it just disappears. That changes time and space around it. And in fact, there should be indications of that just before the planet disappears, right? In other words, that's all in there. We don't like it. And so like I grew up as a scientist studying the auditory system, which is essentially a map of time on multiple scales. And what I noticed is that when trying to communicate results from the auditory system to folks who study the visual system, because the whole signal in the auditory system only has to include time. You don't have a signal without a duration. There was this gap of understanding. And I see the same thing here. If physicists are trying to explain what is going on in the natural universe, so like, tell me about the atoms that are creating this and what's the deal with the water, then they also need to explain duration. There has to be a fundamental duration parameter that is part of what it means to be an object in the physical world. And that is ignored. And that's what I think photons, like one of the things photons are doing. They're grouping together with similar photons based on duration. Somehow, we know they group together with similar photons. We don't really understand why. I also think they're grouping together based on duration, and that's how kind of things are created. So I think this has to do with sort of the fundamental nature of things where we ignore duration and dynamics terrify us. And I think that's all because we know that within that, somehow intuitively, we know that when we unpack that, we're going to get that it's kind of all solved at once. It's this tapestry that's solved at once. And whether you want to call sort of the God's eye view, sort of consciousness of that, when I say God's eye view, I mean sort of looking at past, present, future all at once in all parts of the universe and all levels. Maybe, but I think we could just, I think we're not smart enough yet to know the answer to that. And I think that's an interesting postulate. Did that help?
It helps a bit. If I can just follow that up with something. So that sounds leaning a little more towards the physicalism side.
Well, but see, this division between physical and consciousness, I mean, it is the case that mental things behave differently than physical things. And we call these things mental things and we call some things physical things. but their relationship, I think, is profoundly underappreciated. So so that's why when people say, well, that's physicalist, I'm like, that's like saying like that's about red, it's not about green. It's like, well, they're complementary or not, or they're opposing or whatever they are. They have a relationship and they're stuck in that relationship, and that relationship is not going away. So you're only talking about the head side of the coin. You're not talking about the tails, but there's still the coin. And so I don't know that, I mean, I'm definitely into the idea of consciousness as fundamental, but what is consciousness doing? What are photons the relationship between consciousness and the physical world? Are they sort of both and? Maybe, I don't know. And I don't know that I want to postulate it because I'm so far out of my reach that it just seems silly. I can't test it. And then I come back to empiricism and I'm like, ah, just test some stuff. So yeah, there's something going on there. How about that?
Well, you know, Julie, if I could jump in real quick, I just read this. So you mentioned talking to Roger Penrose, and he did the OR theory. There was an article, was it last week? And they said they had new evidence, and they said this might support OR theory. So I thought that was interesting. It's back in the news, and there's more support for what he and Hameroff were doing.
Yeah, it's this like gravitational collapse idea is gaining traction. After he won his Nobel Prize, people started really looking at that, of course. And so now this gravitational collapse idea is really gaining some traction. Doesn't mean it's right, because there's basically evidence for every theory. So it's more like trying to rule things out, which is where the action is, right?
Yeah. It's interesting. It's interesting.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more to the human mind than we probably imagine or like to imagine, I guess. So.
I don't think you need to use the word probably. I think we have clear evidence that that we don't understand the human mind.
Well, yeah, and when I did my reading, I remember reading that there are a number of quantum effects in nature also. So that,
yeah, in biology.
Like
instance,
photosynthesis.
Yeah, photosynthesis,
right?
bird migration, also rhodopsin molecules in your eye. I mean, also your brain is filled with quantum particles. I mean, so are your body. So this whole idea that there's some kind of division, that's kind of going away. There used to be this idea that quantum particles can't, whatever they're doing is crazy and weird, but it doesn't affect anything at the classical level. That's starting to go away.
Yeah. Well, let me I'm sorry. Did you have another one?
I just had one comment on that last part with Penrose's, and then one follow-up question. So on the Penrose thing, there was a few papers released in the last like 8 or 10 years. They were talking about how they were studying how anesthetics or anesthesia was able to actually collapse the waveform in the microtubules, and that seems to suggest that quantum link there.
But again, they're I mean, so you can't see a wave function collapse. That's an interpretation. And so it's like they observe that a change in the microtubules, and their interpretation is that the wave function collapsed. It could be true, but because theory. Sorry, I was raised by a theoretical physicist and a social worker, and I saw whose work was more impactful, and it was the applied social worker. So I have a bias towards like, what can we actually do? But I get it. Theory is important. It's just sort of like, what can we rule out? Yeah, what can we make? That's where my focus is.
Wonderful. Well, let me go to Phil Bouchard. Phil, thank you for patiently waiting, sir.
Hey, no problem. And thanks for the presentation. That was really great. And sorry if I need to refresh. By the way, I used to work at UCSD, so San Diego is an awesome city. I loved it. I used to live in Pacific Beach, actually. So regarding, I need to refresh my memory a little bit, but the double slit experiment, have we considered the quantum mechanics effect? Like, because I was kind of thinking that the edge of the slit are not constant. You know, the electromagnetic force is kind of fluctuating, so that would make the photon randomly choose a path. So have we started studying the double slit experiment at the quantum level?
You know, some people do, especially people who are doing, my understanding from this world is that people who are looking at quantum foundations So trying to understand that, this is the theory part, trying to really understand, sort of what is the deal with collapse? What is the deal with the double slit experiment? Those are the folks, like the Perimeter Institute folks, I think are more likely to be the ones who are looking at that. But maybe I'm wrong, because again, I like to drive forward. I like to find things that are difficult to explain with our current model, and then try to push people to explain them who aren't me. so I don't know. But I do think that every time I think about the double slit, there's so many. It's so simplified when people describe the system in quantum mechanics and use they use quantum equations to describe the system. It's so simplified. It doesn't seem to. The dynamics of that movement seems important. Also, like the assumption that what's going on at one point on the detector is the same as what's going on at another point in the detector is probably not true. Also, I think you'd be interested. Have you read the Cohen and Ellie Cohen's paper, where he has this really cool, beautiful model about the detector and the emitter and what their relationship is?
No, I
it's
didn't
Cohen
read
and
it.
someone else. I could
Okay.
say I could find it. I think it's in those precog papers I wrote at Tiny URL, and the physics that has a bunch of papers in it. And in the physics folder, there's the Ellie Cohen paper that I'm referring to. So I bet you would like that one, because it's more on the foundations of
Okay.
this. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll check it out. Thanks. But I always wanted to go back on that double slit experiment, but I never had time, So yeah, but I really love the subject.
Very cool. Well, I really appreciate your kind words. And I saw someone wrote in the notes or in the chat that Henri Bergson made that point about duration. I didn't know that. So I also am ignorant about physics philosophy. I'm ignorant about so many things. So now I know that, but good. I think it's a good point. So I'm glad he's a smart cookie.
All right, thanks, and have a good day.
Okay, you too, Philippe.
All right.
Wonderful. Yes, Phil, thank you, sir. Let me see. Let me go to Dejan next, because Jared has already gone. So
Cool. Hi, Dejan.
Hi.
Oh.
Okay. I unmute myself. Yeah. Because your results are actually so good and have a positive measurable bias. Is there a conceivable way to apply it as a technology? Possibly, I'm imagining like chips being able to predict what next calculation is going to be, or something like that.
Yeah, like a quantum speed up that's so fast you know the answer to the question before you ask the question.
Or they make a decisions in advance.
Yeah.
Or make chips become conscious.
Yeah, I can't really comment on that so much, but I do think it's really an interesting area of inquiry. How about that?
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Hey, Jared.
Hey, so
yeah, thanks.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah, Jared, you want to go again, or?
yeah, so with regards to predicting the future, seeing the future in some way, and UAP, to me, it seems like remote viewing tends to come into the conversation at some point. There's been enough research done with it that it seems like there's a there. With regards to the UAP stuff, if you go into, super deep into the rabbit hole on that, there's been plenty of government projects that seem to have utilized this in a way, especially with regards to the UAP phenomenon. I was just wondering if you could comment at all on if you've looked into this, if you've seen how this applies or relates to your research in any way.
Absolutely. Yeah, I started looking at remote viewing 4 or 5 years ago, because the biggest effect sizes for precognition experiments aren't actually from physiology, which is where I started my work. They're in precognitive remote viewing. The biggest effect size, the most consistent. And it's frankly the most useful, because the time delay between the actual observation and the future event is scale free. Like, it doesn't seem to matter. Right. So like 2 seconds from now, a year from now, a couple of 10 years from now, beyond my lifetime, that information, if you're skilled as a remote viewer, seems to be, I mean, So at first I read the data and I thought, well, that's probably not true. But then when I taught myself remote viewing and then went to an actual couple instructors and then got my own team and then started teaching remote viewing, I teach only precognitive remote viewing because I think it's the best, the most accurate and least biased approach. Because at the time, so for those who aren't familiar with remote viewing, it's just a technical way to get information about events distant in time to space. We don't understand how it works. It works. The statistics on that are, since 1995, especially the precognitive version, have been very sound and public, basically a matter of public record. So the question is, what can you do with it, and how can they help us with UAPs, right? And so I have been thinking about this a lot. I would love to do a study on this, but it has to be, responsibly done. And I think that the precognitive piece is key. So like, as soon as I heard about the incident with, is it the Tic Tac incident where they went to the cap point? Yeah, so I heard about that incident and I thought, all right, folks, what are you trying to communicate with? I don't care if it's a thing that contains beings or if it's a thing that's autonomous or if it's a hallucination or whatever it is. What are you trying to communicate by producing something that comes into existence and then meets you in your future location? Are you trying to communicate, we've intercepted your intelligence and we know where the secret place where you're going to meet? That's one thing, right? Another thing you could be trying to communicate, like desperately, is, hey people, get this, we understand how time works now and we can just meet you in the future. And it feels to me like that's the sort of obvious, like over and over again communication. Even it feels like a communication that that the sightings back from 1940s and 1950s were very similar to those now. It's like, again, if you have informational time travel, you can literally at the same time frame go dip into any moment, right, and create the same effect. That's a communication. And so it feels to me, by using precognitive remote viewing, we could potentially like figure out where the next sighting will be and be there to communicate, we figured this out. We have figured out. And that would be a change in our relationship with UAPs, right? And that would be like, now we have a two-way communication. Now we have a method where we're acknowledging that we can converse in this way. And to those who don't understand the data or who don't know about it, it may sound crazy, but like I spent much of my time trying to do rigorous experiments in this area, not in particular with UAPs, but with precognitive remote viewing. And, I mean, even novice people who don't even know what you're talking about, you could get them in 2 minutes to statistically, if you take a look at the whole group, statistically describe a random future target. I mean, it's just so innate in humans to be able to do this. I don't know how we're doing it. Are we accessing photons? Are we doing something else? I don't know, but like we could use the tool. Yeah. Sorry, I just got on a rant.
Oh, no, wonderful. I'm doing work behind the scenes, and again, your presentation was amazing. So I can't thank you enough for joining us today. Let me go to William Alec next. Bill, how are you doing, sir? Oh, Bill, you're muted. There we go.
Hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah. Hi.
Okay, thank you, Tim. Julia, did you see the movie Tenet at all?
Oh yeah, of course.
Last year, where they speak about matter that moves forward in time, and then there's matter that moves backward in time.
Right, and you can't cross the streams.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I thought that was a very interesting movie addressing time forward and time reversal. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that. And also, in the book of Isaiah, the Old Testament, there's some interesting passages in there where they speak about how God views time. And he views time as the universe already happened. He knows the
Alpha and the Omega.
end from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the end from the beginning, which means that everything already happened and that we're kind of like in the past, at some point in time in the past where the future already happened, okay? And that's, we're just traveling at this rate of speed through time in the past.
Yeah.
I was wondering maybe if you had any thoughts about that as well.
Yeah, let's start backwards. So that's when I say God's eye view, that's what I'm talking about, is this idea of it's like a sculpture, like imagine the sculpture over time, and God or the universe or consciousness, whatever, has this access to solving the whole equation all at once. So everything from the beginning to the end. And, but the nature of human consciousness or human experience is that one thing only happens at a time. That's how humans are built. One thing happens at a time. I mean, maybe I shouldn't say one, like at the same time I hear my husband talking on the phone in the other room as I'm giving this talk. So that's not one thing at a time, but like one set of things happens at a time. That's our experience, right? When people die, so either when people die, that's it, right? There's kind of two models. When people die, they sort of don't exist anymore. Another model is that their body is dead, but there's some kind of a consciousness or soul or something that still exists. So that's another model. It's very hard to figure out because how do you define a soul? It's how do you do the experiment, right? But there's other ways to kind of to think about that. But so one model is that when people die, they go into this God's eye view. In other words, they can be available in some sort of conscious way at any moment in time now. And so I sort of see UAPs as living in that, having access to, like, I think at some point we can figure out this equation that describes the whole universe all at once. And then you kind of have access to these different jumping points. When I say jumping points, I mean sort of jumping through space-time, like that space-time, that time cone that I showed, jumping outside of it to get from one place to another rather than being trapped inside of it. I think in our physical form, we are trapped inside of it. I think UFOs are a representation of something that jumps around outside of it and can insert themselves into different places and do things in those places and play with the material things that are in those places. So this is, I mean, I just hope you know this is wild speculation because we're talking about what does the Bible mean and what does the soul mean and all this, right? But like, this is interesting. And then what was the first question?
Oh, the movie Tenet?
Oh yeah, the backwards and forwards. I think so many time travel movies are trying to put these ideas out there in different ways and grappling with what they're not wanting to say is that I think the taboo thing is to say our experience of how time works is not how time works. And our experience of free will is different from what it would be like if we understood free will differently from outside. And I see there's a question on free will because it always comes back to free will when people talk about this stuff. And so the real taboo thing is to say, it's not that there's no free will, it's that from our point of view, of course, there's free will because we're experiencing today's choice and then the consequence, right? From the point of view from the universe, free will isn't even a question. There is no doing. There is no action or flow. It's a sculpture. You don't ask, like, does the cup have free will? It's not changing, right? This is the way the cup is. And so it's like a tapestry. Does a tapestry have free will? So but that doesn't mean that our own experience of free will isn't real. I mean, so I think we love to get in these either or situations, like either physical stuff is true or consciousness stuff is true, but not both. We love it because it just simplifies things. But I think again and again, we are shown by nature and by our nature of our experience and also by our experience of nature, which is sort of what physics is. We are shown that there's this relationship between our experience and sort of a physical reality. There is a relationship that is very close, but not the same. And so where they differ, like in this area of our experience of free will versus this sort of universal calculation, we get confused and we want to choose one. So I think movies like Tenet, they grapple with, well, we can't have forward and backwards at the same time because we still aren't getting it that this idea of any linear time or any causality is actually, that comes from our experience, but not from sort of the external physical reality. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
Good.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, Bill, thank you. Let me go to Eleanor next, who's been patiently waiting.
Hello, I'd like to go back to what you were talking about with
Well, and
remote
Eleanor,
viewing.
if I could ask, sorry, do you think I could ask you to turn on your camera, ma'am?
I don't have a camera, that's a
Okay.
photo. Sorry.
I can see your photo. You have a nice scarf
Okay.
About the remote viewing and your definition of communication. You talked about, from what I understand, you talked about what is being communicated in these remote views that we can see. And you gave some possibilities of what might be communicated to us, or how we might communicate to something else. And I'm wondering if the remote views are really just there, and that it seems like you're implying that there's an intelligence there that is trying to communicate with us, whereas that just seems like an assumption to me. I mean, if a flower is blooming, is it communicating to us, or is it has its life and it has its photosynthesis, it has everything, but is it trying to tell us something?
on.
That's what my confusion is. Thank you.
Yes, that's such a great point. So first of all, just to clarify something, the remote viewing was, we were talking about that, Jared had asked about that as sort of a method of looking at UAPs or trying to understand better UAPs. But the UAP the thing I'm calling communication from UAPs was specifically about communication with UAPs. So the remote viewing was kind of an aside. Why am I assuming that there's a communication? Because just studying animals, like when the way there's different kinds of consciousness, and so one of them is called behavioral consciousness. Behavioral consciousness is sort of a second level order of consciousness, and it's the kind of consciousness that you infer from the outside. It's an inference. So it's like if you poke a worm and the worm moves away from the poke, and then you stop poking the worm and it crawls over to a light, and then you turn off the light and then it goes over to something that's brighter, and then you poke it again and it goes away from the poke. You start to say, okay, there's some kind of behavioral consciousness, maybe not on a high level, but there's some kind of a behavioral aspect that tells me that there's a relationship between this worm and what I'm doing. And that can be considered a kind of communication. Now, it doesn't mean that they're like quoting Proust, but it means that there's some kind of relationship there. So maybe relationship is the better word, because there's clearly a relationship between the activities of humans and the activities of UAPs. And I'm saying maybe it's a communication. Maybe that's trying to set up a communication. And so that, I'm sure other people are saying that too, but I'm also saying it. Does that make it more clear, Eleanor?
Yes. And if you take remote viewing out of the UAP context, is it possible that remote viewing does not have anything to do with UFOs or UAPs, and that
Of course.
that it's something else?
Oh, of course. I mean, remote viewing started, actually the decline of the reputation of remote viewing started when Ed Dames and others in the original Stargate, or they weren't called Stargate then, but anyway, in the original Army-based program started looking at targets that were UFOs, and that was a problem because, of course, there's no validation. Like there's like, okay, that's what you saw, but who knows, right? So there's ways to do remote viewing that have evolved since then, where you can get sort of a group consensus. You can get analyst bias. There's ways to do remote viewing in much better, less irritating and assumptive ways. You can tell how I feel about that. Where you can apply those to anything. So, but remote viewing doesn't have to have anything to do with UFOs. You can use remote viewing to predict the stock market. Tons of people are doing that. You can use remote viewing to try to find missing persons. I think that's a better use of remote viewing. And you could use remote viewing to try to inform. I did a talk, I should post a link, about using remote viewing to inform strategy in intelligence. So that's something else. So there's remote viewing, I think, kind of got caught up with UFOs, but doesn't have to relate to them. It's a methodology for trying to get information. So does that help?
Yes, thank you very much. That answers my question. Yep.
Okay, awesome.
And thank you, Eleanor. Now, Julie, if I could jump in really quick, you mentioned the worm, and and again, I'm moderating, right? So I'm trying not to do too many questions, but it did remind me of, and I think Stuart Hammeroff had talked about this. I know that you're familiar with it. So you talked about communication. I'm changing your example a little bit. So there's intelligence with us as human beings, and then there's intelligence, or as you were talking about this behavior of the worm. If I remember right, one of the things that Penrose Hammeroff were talking about was intelligence is like a scale, right? And they believed that it never went to absolute zero, and that the universe itself had some measure of intelligence, but maybe just very, very low, I guess.
Well, so I think there's a lot of confusion between intelligence and consciousness.
Sorry, yes.
Yeah, no, but it happens a lot. And I think it's tricky because that worm, you could say for sure, is intelligent. I mean, it's survived for, millions of years. So it's more intelligent than we are in a certain sense because we're much younger, right? And so that worm is very intelligent for its environment and well adapted. How conscious is it in terms of a subjective qualia, the experience of things? Question mark, right? We don't know because I don't even know how conscious you are, right? we kind of don't get how to measure consciousness. There are attempts, but we don't really get it. So that's qualia consciousness, that's subjective consciousness. But what people who study consciousness do is they try to infer the subjective experience from the behavior. Some people actually are going after the subjective experience. So with the worm, we don't really get how to get subjective experience at all from the worm. So we try to go after behavior, and we say, oh, it must hurt the worm when the worm does this, right? Well, maybe it doesn't. Maybe there's no subjective experience, right? So yeah, good question.
Yeah. Well, and my apologies. I completely goofed on intelligence versus consciousness. So I'm that guy. But
dude, I mean, this stuff is like no one. It's not like anyone gets it.
Yeah,
there's no goof because there's no one who gets it.
It goes right into the deep end.
Yep.
Let me see. I think it's Aidan is live from the ISDC conference. It's on Mark's channel, but it looks like it's Aidan. Welcome, sir.
Hey, hello. Let me see. I might have to get up close to the camera. Can you hear me? Is it?
Yeah.
Okay. I need to lay the stage a little bit or set the stage, but so in my Buddhist studies, I received teachings and empowerments in the Kala Chakra Tantra, which is the wheel of time in common English. Part of that's due to, when I was younger, I used to have precognitive dreams, quite a bit. And they were usually about a year in advance, which was, there's a deep edge that I don't want to go off right now, but so I learned after a while through meditation that I could probably get into it, or that state of consciousness. It wasn't easy. I'd be watching movies, and once I got to the first plot point, my ego would spool up, and I'd be able to kind of guess or precognitively understand what the movie was going to be about. So with that, and you're talking about the photonic stuff, it's via the dream state where I get premonitional dreams, especially the ground war in Ukraine. For a couple weeks, I was having really bad, death imagery in the dreams. So with the photonic stuff, with this is there, have you thought of any way of like with computing, like quantum-based computing / photonic imagery, photonic circuitry, is there a technology there? If so, would that be usable in the UFOs for when they're, or these flying saucers when they're doing hypervelocity jumps? Let's say the warp drive is real and they're doing like an 18 light year jump in a trip in a matter of months by skipping large distances of time and space. And then you see what I'm getting at? Like,
yeah, but I want to say, like, when we talk about like super luminal jumps or, you know, shortening durations of trips, like the only ones that really matter to me and the ones that make sense to me are the ones where the duration is 0. In other words, they're not in space-time. You're not traveling through space-time. You're not slogging through space-time. You're,
okay.
yeah, you don't have to do that, right? If you understand how the map works, you just go from point A to, you insert yourself into space-time because you're outside of the 4D, you're outside of that, right? So you
Okay.
insert yourself there. And so it's not really a jump, it's only a jump from our point of view. It's not a jump from the point of view of someone who knows how to do that. Like,
Yeah.
right. And so
Okay.
that's the distinction. And I think we have to remember that assumption that when we're looking at things from our point of view, we often get things wrong because we think that there has to be so much, for instance, propulsion, because we're trying to get through space-time. But it's the same thing with, I mean, to go back to the remote viewing thing, I think there's 2 mechanisms of precognition, and one is slogging through space-time, literally, you know, time symmetric information transfer through space-time. And there's another that's much more powerful, and that relates to, for instance, I also had precog dreams since I was a kid, very detailed and with about a year or more, sometimes decades in advance.
Right.
And that has to be a jump through around. That has to be an insertion from outside of space-time.
Okay. Yeah. Like I've had a reoccurring UFO war dream that's the imageries in the Ukrainian ground war precog dreams was starting to tie into this reoccurring UFO war dream that's
right. And so these dreams, so the reason I started studying precognition in remote viewing is that even also in my own dreams, they're very revealing, but they're also very noisy. So they weave in all your emotional stuff and all your fears and all your hopes and whatever's going on in your life, plus this event and a real precognition of a future event. But like, how useless. It gets irritating because it, you know, because it's like, oh, now it's tying into this. And because the subconscious mind is so powerful and it has so much access to this stuff, it kind of overpowers us. We want it to show us a billboard that says this and then this and then this. And instead it's like, oh, 32 things that you can't possibly understand altogether. And so that's why I started looking at remote viewing, because it can kind of slow it down, provide a structure, and bring that same material in, but on request at a pace that works. So that feels to me like the direction to go with that, if you wanted to polish that up.
Oh, yeah, no, I've set up a meditation spot at home. The precognitive dreams when I ran into my guru it was very, very pacifying of the ego, of the small mind, because we were in polite chit chat and he was just like, oh, this and this and this is going to happen to you. And so you kind of got this like I had a 5-year, during waking discussion, a 5-year preview of what was going to go through happen to me. And I couldn't avoid it. Right. It's like these brothers showed up and anyway, had some stuff. I thought if I acted really super nice and did the monastic Buddhist thing for a while, that would change it. If anything, it just made me nicer when the premonitional, these prophecies started happening.
Well, that's good. That seems like a positive outcome. I'm coming from the point of view that, I mean, it doesn't seem like you have a problem. It seems to me from the point of view of trying to increase the amount of unconditional love in the world, you're doing fine.
Yeah,
It's,
I'm still alive.
Yeah, you're still live.
It is interesting. It is interesting. I want to focus this back in a little bit. Aidan, thank you so much.
One last one, if I may. There was a discussion about the time differential, and that for a couple millennia has been thought about in these tantric literature.
Yeah.
And that they say that the heavens, I'm gonna have to kick into Christianity, and like between the first coming and second coming of Christ, Christ is up in heaven for like a day, but down here in the waking world, thousands of years are gonna go by.
Right. There's not there. This is a very different timescape, is the idea.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I agree. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi,
It's-
Elliott. Oh, sorry, Tim.
Oh, no, absolutely. Go for it. Elliott, sir.
Oh, you're muted, maybe?
Elliott, I think your mic might be off. It says that you're not muted, but I can't hear you. Oh, there we go. There we go.
Mhm.
Okay. Love the talk. Amazing.
Okay.
I missed the first 10 minutes, so I apologize if you've covered this. Much of this is new, a little bit of Feynman and then Bohm's wholeness in the implicate order. I'm curious what you make of Bohm's thinking in those directions. And maybe in particular, my sense is that he views the implicate order and the super implicate order as not completely static, like the cup that you mentioned, but there's very different time scale or whatever, but some interplay between different levels of reality or whatever.
Yeah, that's my impression of him too. And the cup is was a representation of space-time, like 3 + 1D. That doesn't mean other stuff isn't going on all around, right?
Okay.
So, so I think of 3 + 1D as sort of the sculpture. Does the sculpture change with its relationship to whatever's going around it? I would say no. It's like there's a little sparkle in the sculpture here that represents Roswell or something, and a sparkle that represents, the Tic Tac incident. And these are actually built in. They were always going to happen. So the relationship between the cup and external to the cup, that was always going to happen. But what's going on out here is actually dynamic.
Okay.
So from the point of view of God or whatever, I mean, it's not from our point of view, but I mean, obviously our own experience is a different story, but if we put ourselves in physical, sort of this proposed physical reality in this point of view, this is dynamic, this is static, the action happens outside of 4D. I don't know if that's true. That's what I'm thinking. I don't know enough to know if I could even defend that. That's just intuitive to me and probably false. How's that?
And are your perspectives pretty similar to Bohm's, and if not, then in what ways do they differ?
I think it's pretty similar. I don't think I understand Bohm enough to, the hidden variable. I mean, the problem, of course, with Bohm are these hidden variables which seem to not exist. And the pilot wave, which may or may exist, which is another way of thinking about the hidden variables. I think I just have to think about it in my own way, and it may be that I'm coming to the same conclusions, but I have different pictures in my head. I'm sorry, I'm speaking about this like a 4-year-old, but that's because that's the only thing I can access right now about it. Yeah, I kind of have to think about it in my own way. I actually can't function in the world of physics without kind of a physics translator who speaks the mathematics, because to me it's this intuitive stuff, and then I have to work with a physicist who can speak to the physicists. You know what I mean? In fact, that's why I couldn't get my the paper I told you about, these causally ambiguous duration effect. Couldn't get it published is because it's like, I can't speak that. I don't know how to speak the language. So I wrote it in like cognitive neuroscience language. So it's never going to get published, but it's a preprint that you can read. But like that, it's it's the pictures. I think we need some kind of non-symbolic mathematics to describe it, and that doesn't exist yet. So it's more like pictures. I'm sorry.
Oh no, this is none of this is easy stuff. And the concepts, I mean, again, the concepts that you're touching on are so interesting. Especially with UAPs. I was trying to think, how does this come back to the propulsion aspect of it? And I think one of those might be that instead of trying to push your way through time and space, you're basically leaving for a higher dimension and coming back. And it is interesting in terms of UAP. This is something I noticed when I was doing research on the UAP nuclear correlation. I saw there was a UFO sighting from Mexico City that's fairly recent. If you look up, UFO Mexico nuclear reactor, and the craft was very interesting. It was like two rings. One was kind of sideways and one was kind of up and down. And it was, somebody just got it on their iPhone camera. It was kind of going behind one of the stacks at this reactor. What got me about that was, as I continued looking, there was one at a nuclear reactor, I think in 1987 or 1989. Something like that. And it was really blurry, right? Because it was the old style TV footage. It was the same craft or an identical craft. And that made me start to think about the time correlation. I was like, that's interesting. Is it the same craft? It's just going from one to the other, and maybe it's a split second in their time or
Well, exactly. And we keep thinking on our time and we think, wow, they've been trying to communicate with us or talk to us or show us themselves or invade us or whatever it is for, 100 years. And instead, once this technology is developed, whether it's developed by us or whomever, whatever, or once it's understood that it's part of the universe, to take Eleanor's point, then there is no more time around how long they've been doing it, right?
Yeah.
It's just like they're like, oh, now we'll just go. Now we add the dots to the painting, And as far as the painting's concerned, if you're going from left to right, that was 100 years. But yeah, so I do think that's something to consider, and it keeps showing up with these kind of the way the sightings are. Also, the geometric shapes, the meaning of the geometric shapes, like you just mentioned, these two circles that are sort of like this, and then lately there's this one about a cube. Like, part of me is like, how much of it is real? How much of it is a hallucination? How much of it is control of photons? Why are many of them without sound? Does that mean that nothing's vibrating and therefore it's it appears and disappears in interesting ways that are sort of we're not physically used to? So yeah, good questions. Yeah.
Well, let me go to Harold really quick. Now it's almost 1:30. Did you want to stop at 1:30, or we could try and make things really quick? It's up to you.
Oh, are you talking to me? Oh, I thought I thought you were asking Harold. It's 1:30. How many more minutes did you say?
Oh, it's about 2 minutes until 1:30. So
right. I know you were taking care of my time. So I can hear that my husband's not ready for lunch yet, and we have this thing where we have this ritual on Saturday where we make lunch.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah,
and
no
so
worries.
This is not a problem.
Okay. Well, let me go to Harold then. Harold, sir.
Yes, the interesting lecture you have there. My question to you is: you brought the double slit experiment, which is very interesting, and physicists argue about it, like Schrodinger, etc. And so my question to you is this: just like the double slit experiment, we have the hardware to do the experiment and the software to do the formula, to make the calculation and determine probability. Now, in talking about consciousness, precognition, and all those other esoteric things, how far into the future do you see that we eventually will have both the software and the hardware to be accurate about the precognition, and we can make prediction about time and everything? How far into the future? Just like we have, the double slit experiment. We know something, and we argue, physicists argue about it.
Yeah. Well, when I was a kid, I used to lie awake at night and get really frustrated about the science funding situation, because it seemed to me that the thing to do was to every nation should put all their money into time travel, because once you solve time travel, every other problem is instantly solved, right? So if you have informational time travel, then from then on, your future group of people can send back, oh, by the way, here's how we cure cancer, and by the way, basically, or you could lock a bunch of scientists in a room. I think I mentioned this before. It's a nice room, but stop time for them and let them cure cancer and then come out instantaneously later and give you the answer, right? So it basically solves all the other problems of science if you could solve this problem. So it seems like high priority. And I was frustrated that more people weren't doing it. But now answering the question of how long will we have essentially like a future prediction chip or something that provides like a double slit, like something that's very obvious. That's what I'm trying to do with my experiment, is to show like, here's an obvious effect that won't go away, that we don't understand. And hopefully it can lead to that. But when will we actually have the machine? I want to answer that in two ways. One way is some kind of number of years, like on 1 to 10 number of years, right? Another way to answer that is to think about once you have it in the future, do you also have it now? In other words, can we bootstrap it, right? So
Yes.
can you learn how to build it from? This is a key theoretical question in physics. Can you learn how to build a time machine from your future selves who have built it? Or do you not get to use it until after the machine is built, and then you can go ahead and send information into the past? But you should be able to send information into arbitrarily long distances in the past if you're hopping around outside of 4D. So anyway, I don't know.
Well, that's a good speculation, and thank you for the answer. Thank you for the presentation. Wonderful.
Okay, glad you enjoyed it. Very speculative. I'll just announce again.
Harold, thank you as well. I remember somebody told me about something. I believe it's called a laser ring interferometer, but basically it's light that goes around in a circle. And there was an experiment where they were trying to send a signal back in time. And if I remember correctly, the idea was it would work, but only back to the beginning of the machine. It had to be when the beam started because it involved the photons. So,
yeah, I think that what you might be talking about, although I'm not sure because of the laser aspect, but I think what you might be talking about is something related to a quantum eraser experiment.
it could be. It could be.
Yeah, and in those experiments, generally you still I don't think they record. I mean, that part of the point is that you have to infer what was there based on the outcome.
Well, it would have to be the information. It would have to be the quantum state, because one of the things, and this came up when I was talking to somebody else, like even with the double slit experiment, right? Those photons are constantly hitting air molecules, being absorbed and being re-emitted. So it's not the photon itself, but it has to be some kind of a state that's transmitted with it, right? That's what you'd think.
Well, so the thing is, we think of photons as billiard balls all the time, and just because we can't help ourselves, but they kind of don't exist unless they're being emitted or absorbed. I mean, in a certain sense, right? So when we ask where the photon is, well, where did you emit it? Where did you detect it? That's what we can know. What's going on between those? We can tell you it's probably not like one photon that's going zing, right? There's all sorts of bouncing off walls and interchanging with electrons and spontaneous emission and all sorts of stuff going on, right?
Yeah.
But then even when I talk about bouncing out off of walls, that sounds like a billiard ball. So it's I think photons are fascinating because they're just not what we think they are, and yet we have to think about them in some way that relates to what other things that we expect physically. I really think it's interesting that they're on the border of the time cone. They have to be on the border of the time cone. So it seems to me like they could be a really nice interface between outside and inside 4D.
Yeah. Well, let me go to Clint Norton next then. Clint, sir? And could I ask you to turn your camera on, Clint? There we go.
Yeah, I'm just saving battery. Back to remote viewing. Have you ever considered the possibility that remote viewing works through energy trails? The very few instances I've had of doing prediction and touching base with things in the past and going orthogonally across the time, I guess you'd call it. It seemed like I found an anchor point, and then I was following a trail to wherever it was I was going. And
I know what you mean.
yeah, and it's just like energy leaves a trace. That's the way I see it. And once the trace is there, whether it's being projected into the future or already left in the past, then it's just a matter of picking up on a energy frequency and following that frequency. At least that's my perception of it.
So I think I know what you mean. I mean, so Ingo Swann talked about it as the signal line, right? The sort of line that you use to get to whatever event or thing that you're remote viewing. I think I wouldn't call it an energetic trail because that suggests it is in space-time.
Why do we limit energy to space-time?
Well, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. But to most physicists, if they hear energy, they're going to start thinking about some kind of energy / matter in space-time with an energy density that's influencing the space-time around it. And so I'm just saying, like, just so when you're talking to physicists about this, it might be just in terms of language or communication, it might be useful to talk about it as like an intentional or an informational trail.
Yeah, that's kind of like social politics.
Yeah. I don't need you to. I'm just trying to explain. Like I had this reaction to the word energetic, and I just wanted to explain that in a kind way because I imagine that if you brought that up to someone, they might have that experience. But I know what you mean, and I think that in fact I've done some of the ways that when you teach remote viewing to a team, it's actually helpful for you to basically beat a trail to the target yourself. And then the students have an easier time beating a trail to the target. It's like they don't have to beat so hard because there's the trail. You know, that's anecdotal, but that's what I've observed. So I think I know what you mean. And I think that trail is intention based. So the more focused your intention, one of the results I have from the remote viewing, precognitive remote viewing, is the more you focus your attention and the more that intention is coming from a place of unconditional love, the better accuracy you have. So positive, loving intention actually supports accuracy in precognitive remote viewing, which to me supports this idea that it's intention-based.
Yeah, I can't disagree with you there, but that's just, that's the way I perceive it. Let's move on to somebody else.
That's really cool. Thanks for sharing that, Clint.
Yeah, and Michael, thank you, sir. So let me go back to Elliott next, sir.
I'm curious what kind of relationship you see between the development of our physics understanding, our technical understanding, and also, let's say, meditation or metaphysical development, inner development.
Physical understanding, metaphysical development. Yeah, that's interesting. So many physicists and scientists in general, but physicists in particular who meditate, talk about either in dreams or in meditation, just receiving information from the future or connecting with their future self to do a better experiment or to think better thoughts about their theory, something that actually works out. My whole life, that's how I have chosen the experiments that I do. They just come to me, maybe I'm waking or falling asleep or in a dream or in a remote viewing session or during the day when I'm taking a shower or dancing around, something that's not science. I think that this division that we're taught to have, at least in the Western world, we're taught to have this division between the stuff that's unconscious and all this operation that's going on sort of at the base of the iceberg, and the stuff that we're conscious of up here, which is supposed to be more rational and deliberative. I think that division starts to loosen up a little when you get safe enough in your own mind that you know you're not going to go crazy with ideas bubbling up. So if you're a mentally healthy person, there's some good differentiation between all the stuff going on down here, which can get very weird, and the stuff that goes on up here, right? That's good differentiation that helps you live your life and like pay the rent and leave your bedroom, right? But over time, as you meditate, it's like it starts to feel safer to have these things come up. And you also start to get some discernment. In my experience, and I know that the cities talk about this, the Hindu scriptures have much more experience with meditation than I do. But this idea that this discernment kicks in where you kind of know or feel or sense what the key insights are that are coming up versus just like, I'm afraid that my kid isn't going to get a job after college, so I'm going to have this fantasy that he doesn't get a job after college. You know what I mean? Like it's a sort of key insights that have to do with the progress of a scientific field versus your own sort of egoic or emotional feelings about something. And that discernment helps guide science. And I think it always has. And before science, I think it guided metaphysics and philosophy. I think it guides progress in every culture. Is developing that discernment. And when we don't develop the discernment, and when the maturity or the ego development of a culture gets to the point where we forget that discernment is important, so we start to say it's okay for just everything that comes through is important and useful for the progress of the culture, or nothing should come through. Either of those extremes makes it so that there's less progress.
That kind of speaks a lot to, discernment sounds somewhat cognitive to me.
Mm-hmm.
What about compassion, loving heart, that kind of purification? Does that remain important or unnecessary?
Well, so discernment, I don't mean just cognitive, and I'm sorry, I get that it would sound that way. Yeah, so by discernment, I mean, it's almost like, it's not like my discernment as a meditator or your discernment. It's kind of like the discernment. So it's like the discernment, you have better access to the discernment, which comes from a source of unconditional love that exists in the universe, which is not generated by you. So that when I start talking to people about unconditional love, the biggest number one mistake that people have is they think that they have to generate this thing that's called unconditional love. It's like, no, this is a thing that exists in the universe and you can access it, and you access it. It's like no one's walking around saying, well, I have to wake up early, I got to get the sun up because I have to make the sun literally go up in the sky. Like that is not how we relate to the sun, but that's how we relate to this concept. And so I should put an article I wrote about unconditional love on here. I'll put it in the chat window. But anyway, this discernment is sort of the discernment we can all access. And that doesn't mean that we get to decide that our way of accessing it. I mean, the other piece that happens is people say, I've accessed this discernment and I know the truth and people should just do what I say. That's not it either. So the discernment is also about recognizing like my own limitations as a person and my own lack of ability to just to access the God's eye view, right? Like get some humility. None of us has the God's eye view. So what can we do from our place, of humility?
And can you put in the chat or in some kind of follow-up email 2 or 3 of your favorite articles or books for someone wanting to get started with your work?
Oh,
yeah,
sure.
or your website. Let's put that in.
Okay, sure. I'll put it in the chat. loveandtime.org. I agree that not all UAPs are the same, by the way. Loveandtime.org. My for-profit is mossbridgeinstitute.com. And my favorite place for you to download papers is tinyurl.com/precog papers 2022. That's kind of a compendium.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. You all have been super great. And Tim, you've been, I see you there like reading the chat and managing all the different ideas and dodging all the pitfalls, and you did a great job.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and so right now it's 1:45, and again, you know, it's I have a block of time until 2, but I have another speaker as well, so it's entirely up to you, ma'am. Yeah.
I think I should go. The natives are getting restless, and but this has been just fantastic, and the questions from so many different angles. It makes me really happy.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Well, Julia, let me thank you again. Let me put it back on gallery. I want to have everyone give you an enormous hand again. Thank you for the presentation and for answering all of the questions and for so many thoughtful insights. I mean, it's a little bit different for us, but it's as you can see, this audience is incredibly interested in this stuff. So it's wonderful to have you here with us. So.
Thank you, thank you. What a great crowd. So I hope to go to some more of these again. I hope someday you have them on a Sunday or another day of the week. I pray for that.
Okay. Well, thank you again. So let me do this then. I'm going to put this back on speaker mode, and I'm going to go to our next guest, who is David Alzofon. And